Two nuclear powers, one secret back channel, and a deal that the entire Middle East was holding its breath for. It collapsed. Not because of bombs, not because of missiles, but because of 3 words spoken in a conference room in Islamabad that sent shockwaves from Washington to Tehran to Tel Aviv. Iran said no. And when Iran says no to America at this particular moment in history, with Israeli jets on standby, with U.S. carrier groups in the Persian Gulf, with oil markets watching every headline, that no doesn't just end a negotiation. It potentially starts something far more dangerous. So today I want to walk you through exactly what happened in Islamabad, why these talks were historic before they even began, what conditions America put on the table, why Iran walked away, and what comes next for a region that is already one miscalculation away from a war that none of us can afford. Part 1. Why Islamabad? The back channel that nobody was supposed to know about. Let's start with the location itself. Because Islamabad is not an accident. When 2 countries that have no diplomatic relations, countries that have spent 45 years calling each other enemies, want to talk without the world watching, they don't meet in Geneva. They find a third country, a quiet room, a trusted broker. Pakistan has played that role before, quietly, discreetly, with very little credit. It was Pakistan's back channels that helped facilitate early U.S.-China contact before Nixon's famous 1972 visit to Beijing. Pakistan has hosted secret meetings between Afghan factions, between Indian and Pakistani intelligence officials, and between Gulf states during moments of regional crisis. So when the decision was made to attempt a new round of U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, Pakistan raised its hand. And both Washington and Tehran, cautiously, reluctantly, agreed. The talks were supposed to be quiet, exploratory, a feeling-out process. The kind of diplomatic contact where both sides can deny anything was agreed upon if the whole thing blows up. But here's the problem. In the age of satellite phones, intelligence leaks, and regional powers with their own agendas, nothing stays quiet for long. Within days of the Islamabad meetings beginning, reports started leaking, first from Israeli intelligence sources, then from Iranian hardline media, then from American officials who opposed the talks entirely and wanted to kill them before they could produce anything. And suddenly, a quiet back channel became a very public test of whether America and Iran could sit in the same room without the whole thing falling apart. It failed that test, but to understand why, you need to understand what each side actually wanted going into that room. Part 2. What America wanted, and why it was always going to be a hard sell. America's position going into Islamabad was built around one core demand: complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Not a pause, not a cap, not a return to the limits of the 2015 JCPOA, the nuclear deal that Trump tore up in 2018. Complete, verifiable, permanent dismantlement. The U.S. wanted Iran to reduce its uranium enrichment to near zero. It wanted international inspectors to have unrestricted access to every nuclear facility in the country, including military sites that Iran has always refused to open. And it wanted all of this locked into a framework that a future American president could not simply walk away from with the stroke of a pen. In exchange, America was offering sanctions relief. Gradual, conditional, reversible sanctions relief. Not the full lifting of all economic restrictions on Iran. A phased process tied to Iranian compliance at every step. Now, I want you to think about this from Iran's perspective for a moment. Iran has been under American sanctions for over 4 decades, since 1979. Since the hostage crisis, its economy has been strangled, its currency has been destroyed, and its people have paid an enormous price. And yet, through all of that, Iran built its nuclear program anyway. It enriched uranium to 60% purity. It installed thousands of advanced centrifuges. It got to within weeks of weapons-grade enrichment capacity. That program is not just a military asset to Iran. It is a bargaining chip. It is leverage. It is the one thing that gets America to pick up the phone and ask for a meeting. So when America walks into a room and says, dismantle everything, give up your leverage, accept inspectors into your most sensitive military sites, and in exchange we'll maybe lift some sanctions that we can always reimpose, Iran's answer is predictable. No, not because Iran wants a nuclear war, but because Iran's leadership is not suicidal. They understand negotiation, and they know that a country that gives up its leverage before getting a guaranteed enforceable deal gets nothing. History taught them that lesson. We'll get to that in a moment. Part 3. What Iran wanted, and why America couldn't give it. Iran came to Islamabad with its own list, and it was just as ambitious as America's demands. First, full, immediate, and permanent lifting of all nuclear-related sanctions. Not phased, not conditional. Now, second, a legally binding guarantee that the United States would not withdraw from any new agreement. Iran watched Trump tear up the JCPOA in 2018 after America had already gotten Iranian compliance. They were not going to make that mistake again. They wanted something enforceable in international law, not just a presidential executive agreement that the next administration could shred. Third, a formal acknowledgement by the United States of Iran's right to civilian nuclear enrichment on its own soil. This is a point of national pride in Iran that goes far beyond strategy. Iranian leaders across all political factions, reformist and hardline alike, have consistently said that enrichment on Iranian soil is a red line. Fourth, removal of all sanctions, not just nuclear ones. The U.S. has layered sanctions on Iran for terrorism designations, human rights violations, missile program activities, and regional proxy support. Iran wanted the entire structure dismantled. Now here's the problem. America could not give Iran most of these things, not because American negotiators didn't want a deal, but because of the domestic political reality in Washington. Any agreement that gives Iran guaranteed sanctions relief, accepts Iranian enrichment, and ties the hands of future administrations would face immediate and ferocious opposition in the U.S. Congress. It would be painted as appeasement. It would be used as a political weapon in the next election cycle. And Israel, America's closest ally in the region, has made it absolutely clear that any deal which leaves Iran with an active enrichment program is unacceptable. Israel has the lobby, the intelligence relationships, and the political influence in Washington to make good on that opposition. So you had two sides in Islamabad, both aware that the other side was constrained, both making demands they knew were difficult, both looking over their shoulders at domestic audiences that would punish them for appearing weak. In that environment, a deal was always going to be nearly impossible. But here's where things took a darker turn. Part 4, The Ghost in the Room, How 2015 Haunts Every Iran Negotiation. To understand why the Islamabad talks collapsed the way they did, you need to go back to 2015. In 2015, after years of secret negotiations, the Obama administration produced the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. It was called the Iran nuclear deal, and it was celebrated around the world as a diplomatic breakthrough. Under the deal, Iran agreed to dramatically reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, limit enrichment to 3.67% purity, reduce the number of operating centrifuges by 2/3, and accept rigorous inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency. In exchange, the United States and its European partners agreed to lift nuclear-related sanctions and release billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets. Iran complied. Every major inspection confirmed it. The IAEA issued report after report verifying Iranian compliance. And then, in May 2018, Donald Trump walked away. He called the deal the worst deal ever negotiated. He reimposed all the sanctions, and he added new ones. The maximum pressure campaign that followed crushed the Iranian economy. Inflation exploded. The Iranian rial lost most of its value. Ordinary Iranians, people who had nothing to do with their government's foreign policy, paid the price. Now I want you to sit with that for a second. Iran gave up real, tangible, verified nuclear capability in exchange for a deal that lasted 3 years before the other side simply decided to leave. That experience fundamentally changed how Iran's leadership thinks about any future negotiation with the United States. It is not paranoia, it is not stubbornness, it is a rational lesson learned from a very specific, very painful experience. You cannot trust a deal with America that is not legally enforceable. You cannot give up your leverage before you have a guarantee that cannot be reversed. Because if you do, you end up with nothing. Worse than nothing. You end up weaker than you started. That is the ghost that haunted every conversation in Islamabad. Every time the American side pushed for Iranian concessions up front, the Iranian delegation didn't need to say anything complicated. They just had to say 2 numbers. And the room went quiet. Part 5. The regional players who don't want a deal. But here's something that doesn't get enough attention in Western media coverage of these talks. There are powerful players in this region who actively do not want a US-Iran deal, and they were working against the Islamabad talks before they even began. Israel is the most obvious one. Prime Minister Netanyahu has spent decades arguing that any deal which leaves Iran with nuclear enrichment capability is an existential threat to Israel. Israel has conducted covert operations against Iran's nuclear program, assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists, sabotaging centrifuge facilities with cyber weapons, destroying a facility in Isfahan with drone strikes. These are not the actions of a country preparing to accept a diplomatic resolution. Israel wants the Iranian nuclear program eliminated. Not negotiated with. Eliminated. Then there are the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, countries that have their own complicated relationship with Iran. On one hand, Saudi Arabia recently normalized relations with Tehran through the China broker deal in 2023. On the other hand, a nuclear-capable Iran is still their worst nightmare. They fear that any deal that legitimizes Iranian enrichment simply delays the problem rather than solving it. And inside Iran itself, the hardliners are not passive observers. Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, has enormous economic and political power inside the country. They profit from the sanctions economy, black market smuggling networks, parallel financial systems, weapons exports. These are IRGC businesses. A sanctions-free Iran that opens up to Western investment is actually a threat to their power. So, Iranian hardliners have every incentive to torpedo a deal, and they have the institutional power to do it. When leak after leak came out of Islamabad, many analysts pointed directly at IRGC-linked intelligence networks as the source. The talks weren't just killed by the distance between the two negotiating positions. They were killed by a coordinated effort by people on multiple sides who decided that no deal was better than a deal. Part 6. What happens now? The 3 scenarios. So the talks have collapsed. Iran has rejected the American conditions. The back channel is broken. What comes next? I see 3 realistic scenarios. And I want to be honest with you, none of them are comfortable. The first scenario is a return to maximum pressure. The United States, faced with Iranian rejection, doubles down on sanctions. It works to isolate Iran economically and diplomatically. It tightens the enforcement of oil export restrictions, cutting off the revenue Iran needs to fund its proxy network and its nuclear program. This is the path of attrition. The hope is that economic pain eventually forces Iran back to the table on better terms. The risk is that Iran accelerates its nuclear program instead of slowing it, using the absence of any deal as justification to push enrichment closer to weapons grade. The second scenario is military escalation. This is the scenario that intelligence agencies are most worried about. If Iran moves enrichment to 90% weapons grade, Israel will face enormous domestic and strategic pressure to act militarily. An Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities would almost certainly trigger Iranian retaliation against Israeli and American targets across the region. And that is how a regional conflict becomes something much larger and much harder to contain. The Persian Gulf, through which 20% of the world's oil supply passes, becomes a war zone. Oil prices hit numbers that would trigger a global recession. Every economy on Earth feels it. The third scenario is the most quiet and the most dangerous. Iran decides it no longer needs a deal at all. It completes its nuclear breakout capability. It becomes a threshold nuclear state, a country that has everything needed to build a weapon but hasn't formally declared one. Like Japan, like South Korea, like Brazil. Countries with full nuclear capability that use that capability as strategic deterrence without ever pulling the final trigger. This is what Iran's leadership may be calculating right now. Why negotiate? Why give up leverage? Why trust a deal that America can walk away from whenever it changes its mind? Just build the capability, use the ambiguity, and let every adversary in the region factor that uncertainty into their strategic planning. If that is Iran's conclusion after Islamabad, then the talks didn't just fail. They may have been the last serious diplomatic off-ramp before a fundamentally new and far more dangerous Middle East takes shape. The final thought. Here's what I want to leave you with. The collapse of the Islamabad talks is being reported as a diplomatic failure. A negotiation that didn't produce a deal, a setback that both sides will blame on the other. But I think it's something more significant than that. It is the latest chapter in a pattern that stretches back decades. A pattern where the United States and Iran circle each other, close enough to talk, far enough to never fully commit, where the domestic politics on both sides consistently punish compromise and reward confrontation, where the most extreme voices on each side have the most to gain from permanent hostility. This pattern has a cost, and that cost is not paid by the politicians making speeches in Washington, or the hardliners marching in Tehran. It is paid by the Iranian family, whose savings disappeared overnight when sanctions destroyed their currency. By the American soldier deployed to yet another tense standoff in the Persian Gulf. By the family in Lebanon, or Yemen, or Iraq, caught in a proxy conflict, financed by a rivalry between two countries that have never once sat down and genuinely decided to end it. The Islamabad talks failed, but the need for a solution didn't go anywhere. And the next time there's a crisis, the next incident in the Strait of Hormuz, the next missile strike, the next escalation, the world will wish someone had found a way to make those talks work. History doesn't wait for politicians to get comfortable. It just keeps moving. And the countries that fail to read where it's heading, they always end up on the wrong side of it. That's the story of Islamabad. And this is exactly the kind of analysis you will never get from a 30-second news headline. If you want to understand the real forces shaping the world, the history, the economics, the power, and the decisions that nobody explains properly, then this channel exists for you. Every video I make connects the dots between past and present in a way that makes the chaos of today's news actually make sense. Subscribe to Finance Historian.